The security architecture in the region is characterized by bilateral alliances of the United States in a way, hub and spoke system, and then a lack of multilateral organizations and alliances for organizations for security cooperation or even multilateral alliances. Now, Professor Kuig, I would start with you and ask you, why is it so difficult for countries in Asia to build those multilateral security organizations or multilateral alliances, and what roles do the great powers play in that?
All right. Thanks very much, Thomas. I thought this is a very good question, but also a difficult question. And to talk about the role and also limitation of ASEAN, I think the first thing to say is that ASEAN is a regional multilateral organization, but clearly it is not an alliance. And I would say that to talk about the role of ASEAN, I like to use 3I to capture, both the plus and also the limitations of ASEAN as a regional grouping. While it is true that the difficulties, challenges, limitations have always been associated with ASEAN as a regional grouping, but I think to make things more balanced and also comprehensive, we should also not lose sight on the achievements of ASEAN despite all those challenges. So these 3Is, to me, capture that dynamics. And there are realities that have been there and will continue. So I like to describe ASEAN as a imperfect, often inefficient, but always indispensable regional organization. And some would describe ASEAN, despite all the problems and limitations, describe ASEAN as the most successful regional grouping outside of EU. Some say that EU is the most successful regional grouping. Nobody would dispute that. But ASEAN clearly is not there. It's a different creature compared to EU. But among the developing countries, developing worlds or global south, ASEAN clearly stand out because of, as I said, despite the challenges, limitations, ASEAN has delivered and play a role that is indispensable, benefiting the 10 ASEAN member countries. In the process, also help all the dialogue partners in the region and also outside of the region to play a part in the region at the important areas. So I would say that the limitations and also ineffectiveness are there. People would quote, for example, the problem of Myanmar. People talk about the South China Sea issues or things that are involving sovereignty issue. Yeah? And especially those issues that involving big powers. So just like nobody would expect EU to solve Ukraine problem, I think we shouldn't expect ASEAN to solve South China Sea, multi-nation, multi-power territorial disputes. And sovereignty issues like Myanmar will always be there. Again, it's quite difficult to expect actually ASEAN to tackle that. And I would say that, but despite all those problems and inadequacies, let's not forget that ASEAN will always, has been and will always be indispensable in a number of areas. Number one, and this is quite often overlooked by now, ASEAN was created primarily to manage the intra-ASEAN problems. It was established, in light of, in the wake of confrontasi for 3 years. It's not war, it's low intensity conflict, but it affects almost everyone in the region back then during the Cold War context, right?
So you would say that ASEAN has prevented at least the conflict and
that's
the war,
right. And and we could also bear in mind that before that, Southeast Asia was remembered as or described as Balkans of the East and Asia, right? Because of we are so different within the national boundary and across the national boundaries. Those problems, differences can easily be spilled over as interstate conflict. Today, bearing in mind what happened during confrontasi, but today I think with the establishment of ASEAN, we have not really seen the kind of like interstate conflict, even though we have all the reasons to go to war or conflict with one another. But today, we do not think that, the use of force among Southeast Asia is an option. So ASEAN quietly, people don't talk about it, but many in the ASEAN region remember that actually we don't take the regional peace, stability for granted. And the biggest role, indispensable role for ASEAN is really to manage the intra-ASEAN problem. Those problems might still be there, but at least and as long as we don't go to war, armed conflict among one another, I think this is already the biggest credit that we should give to ASEAN as a grouping. It's also indispensable in the sense that it actually allows us meaning not just ASEAN countries, but also, as I mentioned, dialogue partners in Asia and outside of Asia to come together for corporations. It's not just to avoid the problem, but to actually create something positive that will affect people and in a positive way. Since we are in Korea, let's take RCEP as an example, right? Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the 15-nation economic cooperation that has been described as the largest FTA in the world. And it's a 15-nation in the sense that it's 10 ASEAN countries plus the 3 Northeast Asian countries of Korea, Japan, China, Australia, and also New Zealand, right? It took a number of years, 8 years negotiation, and it became a reality after like an 8-year negotiation. It came out during the height of COVID pandemic period, where for 2-3 years there was no good news at the regional global level, but RCEP came out. And I would argue, without ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism, RCEP would not have been possible. Things that the 3 economic powerhouses of Korea, Japan, China have been working very hard to come up among themselves for economic logic, but political logic does not allow that to happen. But with the ASEAN-led mechanism, people laugh about ASEAN as a talk shop. In Southeast Asia, we certainly don't think so. As I mentioned, it's imperfect, inefficient, but always indispensable, helping ASEAN countries and also help any dialogue partners, external powers who are willing to take us seriously.
I think Professor Quick gave an excellent run through of the benefits and the challenges that ASEAN faces. I mean, maybe just to step back a little bit, I think the discussion around organizations like ASEAN is one where the focus is sometimes on the negative, on those challenges too much. I think that stems from an outsider's perspective, looking in and having almost a mirroring expectation that organizations like ASEAN will necessarily evolve into all these other ways that, say, the European Union has. Yeah. So if the European Union can, why can't ASEAN? And I think that's probably a misunderstanding of regional expectations, of regional interests, and the comfort level at which these countries really seek to drive the evolution of these organizations. At the end of the day, it's about the constituent parts of ASEAN, of the 10 Southeast Asian member states, and their own comfort level for how far they want to take this organization. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There are challenges, but every single organization has those. If we look at various aspects of even the European Union, for example, not everyone's on the same page all the time, and European Union evolution itself has taken a long road to get to where it is today. So sometimes I think we forget a little bit the trajectory and the longevity and the duration and effort that it takes to get to where we were, from in the past to today in, for example, the EU. Just on ASEAN specifically in security, I mean, this is obviously a highly sensitive issue. I think we do see security cooperation between ASEAN member states to differing extents. There was the ASEAN military exercise as well, which perhaps you can speak more on. But we do see those incremental steps towards thinking about how ASEAN member states can collaborate more and cooperate more on security issues. Again, will that go towards the extent of having a unified solution on the South China Sea? We have the Code of Conduct negotiations ongoing, of course, as a diplomatic route via ASEAN and China. But whether it will go beyond that, I think, is perhaps maybe a step too far at the moment.
ASEAN will have to be a part and parcel of the equation. But clearly with ASEAN it's not enough, which is why we need the security arrangements. But security arrangement is not the simple issue, black and white issue of alliance or no alliance. Yeah. I think ASEAN countries rejected that kind of either or. We think that, alliance might be necessary, especially for those who have always been part of alliance, right? So we know Philippines and Thailand, they have been the treaty allies of US since last century at the height of Cold War. But others decided not to adopt alliance as a kind of like an external approach. But it doesn't mean that we dismiss security arrangement. We do pursue a lot of alignment arrangements, right? It's an alignment without alliance. And an alignment that is not necessarily targeting at anyone, but mainly for contingency. We would invest, involve, and adapt based on the degree of threat perception, danger perception, so on and so forth.